London, 1888. A city smothered in fog, poverty, and fear. In the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, a killer was waiting. He didn't strike in daylight. He didn't give warnings. He moved in silence, and when he vanished into the shadows, he left behind bodies so brutalized that even hardened detectives turned pale. The newspapers gave him a name the world would never forget: Jack the Ripper. For more than a century, his story has haunted every corner of crime history. A faceless butcher who taunted police with letters soaked in arrogance, who seemed to know the streets better than anyone, who vanished without ever being caught. But today, the legend is colliding with modern science. Forensic breakthroughs, DNA technology, and a blood-stained piece of cloth are pulling the Ripper's ghost back into the light. Could it be that after 137 years, we finally know his name? This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about fear, obsession, and the desperate search for justice. From the cobbled streets of Whitechapel to cutting-edge DNA labs, from the families of victims to the descendants of suspects, the Ripper's shadow still stretches across time. And in that shadow, one truth waits to be uncovered. The question is, are we ready to hear it?
Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.
London, 1888. The city was restless, its air heavy with smoke, its streets soaked in shadows. The East End was a place many Londoners feared to tread, but for thousands of men, women, and children, it was the only world they knew. Whitechapel was bursting at the seams with lodging houses and gin shops, where desperation was currency and survival was a daily negotiation. The wealthy passed through in their carriages with the windows shut, but down in the alleys, the poor walked with their heads lowered, never knowing what the night might bring. In this maze of narrow passages and gaslit corners, fear was already part of life. Poverty, violence, and hunger haunted every family. But in the summer of that year, something darker began to stir. A presence moved through the fog, silent and invisible, choosing his moments with unnerving precision. He left no warnings, offered no mercy, and when he vanished into the mist, he left behind something so terrible that even the most hardened detectives struggled to look at it. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, though her friends called her Polly. She was 43 years old, a mother of 5, long separated from her husband, and she lived night to night in the common lodging houses of Whitechapel. On the evening of August 31st, she was turned away from her bed because she did not have the few pennies needed for a night's rest. She laughed it off with a friend, pointing to her bonnet, saying she would soon earn enough to cover it. They were the last words anyone would hear from her. In the small hours of the morning, a carman on his way to work stumbled upon her body in Buck's Row. At first, he thought she was simply drunk, as so many were on those streets. But when the light caught her throat, the horror revealed itself. Her neck had been cut twice, deep and deliberate, and her abdomen had been savaged with a precision that suggested more than rage. It was not only killing, it was something colder, more methodical. The police were summoned, and even seasoned officers froze when they saw the extent of the injuries. A doctor called to the scene whispered that whoever had done this possessed not only brutality but some knowledge of anatomy. It was unlike anything they had witnessed before. News traveled fast in London. By dawn, word of the mutilated woman spread from market stalls to public houses, and by the time the papers hit the stands, fear had ignited. This was no ordinary crime of the East End. This was something else entirely, and it carried a sense of purpose that terrified everyone who heard of it. And so began the autumn of terror. Within weeks, more women would be found, each death more brutal than the last, each scene sending ripples of panic through the city. The killer would be given a name, one that still chills us today: Jack the Ripper. For generations, the murders have remained unsolved. Detectives tried and failed, writers obsessed, historians pored over every detail. And yet no one could say with certainty who walked those streets, knife in hand, more than a century ago. But now the story has shifted. In recent years, science has tried to do what the police of Victorian London could not. A shawl, stained with blood and said to have been found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, another victim, became the centerpiece of a modern investigation. Forensic testing claimed that DNA on that cloth matched both the descendants of Eddowes and the descendants of a man long suspected, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber who lived in Whitechapel at the time of the killings. The announcement was bold. Russell Edwards, the man who funded the research, declared the mystery solved, saying the evidence was 100% certain. Headlines screamed that Jack the Ripper had finally been unmasked. Some believed it, others doubted. The Shaw's history was murky, its journey through the years uncertain, and experts questioned whether contamination could explain the results. Yet in 2025, the claim returned with force. Families of the victims stepped forward, supporting calls to reopen the inquest and give their ancestors justice by naming the killer officially. The debate reignited in newspapers and across television screens. Could it really be true that after more than a century, we finally know his identity? Or is this just another twist in a story that refuses to die? Today, you can walk the same streets where Polly Nichols once walked, where Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly met their fate. Tourists tread the cobblestones on guided walks, hearing whispers of blood and mystery, while laboratories across the world continue to examine every scrap of possible evidence. The Ripper's shadow has never left London, and in many ways, it has never left us. The first killing was not just the death of a woman in a dark alley. It was the beginning of a nightmare that gripped a city and refused to let go. And as the body of Mary Ann Nichols lay cold in Bucks Row, no one could yet know what was coming. The police braced themselves for answers. The press sharpened their pens. The public lit their lamps and watched the shadows. But in those shadows, the Ripper was already waiting for his next victim. Only days after the body of Mary Ann Nichols was laid to rest, Whitechapel was still trembling. People whispered her name in the streets, and the newspapers sold out in minutes with lurid details about her wounds. But fear was not confined to the headlines. It crept into doorways, into the eyes of women who had no choice but to walk the streets at night. The poorest had nowhere to hide. On the night of September 7th, just a week after Nichols's killing, 47-year-old Annie Chapman was seen wandering near Hanbury Street. She was ill, weakened by years of hardship and drink, her life already a fight for survival. Like Polly, she had been turned away from a lodging house because she did not have the few coins needed to pay for a bed. She told the keeper not to worry. She would earn the money soon enough. It was a phrase that had already become tragically familiar in Whitechapel. By dawn, her body lay in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street. The sight was even worse than Nichols's murder. Her throat had been cut so deeply that blood pooled beneath her, but it was her abdomen that froze the police in disbelief. She had been ripped open with chilling precision, organs removed and placed beside her in a grotesque display. The violence was not random. It carried purpose, as if the killer wanted the city to see what he was capable of. When Inspector Joseph Chandler arrived, he ordered the crowd pushed back, but word spread too quickly. By mid-morning, hundreds of onlookers had gathered outside Hanbury Street, straining for a glimpse of the horror within. Some said prayers. Others cursed the police for failing to protect the women of Whitechapel. Detectives debated what the mutilations meant. One doctor insisted that the cuts suggested anatomical knowledge, perhaps even the skill of a surgeon or butcher. Another argued that it was the work of a madman with steady hands. Either way, the conclusion was unavoidable. The same man who killed Mary Ann Nichols had struck again, and he was only growing bolder. The press seized upon it. The Star ran with the headline, "Another horrible murder in Whitechapel," and the public demanded answers. Scotland Yard doubled its patrols, but Whitechapel's alleys could not be policed by lamplight alone. Too many corners, too many shadows, too many lives slipping through the cracks. Fear was now tangible. Women carried sticks or walked in pairs. Men escorted their wives and daughters to markets. Lodging house keepers locked their doors earlier. And yet every night, desperation drove women back onto the streets. Hunger left them with no choice. Behind closed doors, detectives began reviewing their lists of suspects. Foreign immigrants were eyed with suspicion. Butchers, doctors, and slaughterhouse workers were questioned. Rumors spread that a figure had been seen lurking in the fog near Hanbury Street, a man in a peaked cap, silent and watchful. But no name, no face, no evidence brought the police closer to their quarry. What terrified the investigators most was not only the brutality of the killings, but the escalation. The wounds on Annie Chapman suggested the killer had grown more confident, more deliberate. He had not just repeated what he had done before, he had taken it further. And if the pattern was real, then he would strike again. In the pubs of Whitechapel, men argued over who the killer might be. Some swore it was a butcher, slipping away from the market stalls at night. Others believed it was a doctor, a man with money and knowledge who came slumming in the alleys. There were even whispers of a royal connection, a scandal hidden beneath the cloak of privilege. But in truth, nobody knew. By September, the city was on edge. Women looked over their shoulders as they walked, and men quickened their pace when footsteps echoed behind them. Even the police officers patrolling the streets admitted to feeling watched. The Ripper, as he would soon be named, seemed to strike at will, appearing and disappearing without a trace. At Annie Chapman's funeral, hundreds lined the streets, hats removed, silence heavy in the air. For them, this was not a story in the papers. It was life, it was death, and it was happening only steps away from their homes. A priest spoke of justice, but many in the crowd doubted it would come. The killer was too quick, too careful, and the police too overwhelmed. The detectives worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses who claimed to have seen Annie with a man before her death. One described him as foreign-looking with a dark mustache. Another said he wore a deerstalker hat. The descriptions contradicted each other, leaving investigators frustrated. Eyewitness memory in the gaslit fog was a fragile thing, and the killer seemed to know it. In the days that followed, London braced itself. The first murder could have been dismissed as an isolated act of violence. The second erased any doubt. The city now faced a predator, one who killed not for money, not for revenge, but for something far darker. And while detectives plotted maps of Whitechapel and the press fanned the flames of hysteria, the killer himself melted back into the shadows, silent and patient. He had already shown the city what he could do. The question was not whether he would strike again, it was when. And when that night came, it would prove that the terror was only beginning. The city of London had hardly begun to recover from Annie Chapman's murder when the killer returned. The leaves of September had barely fallen, the nights were drawing colder, and in Whitechapel the sense of dread deepened with each passing evening. People whispered about him now not as an unknown assailant, but as a phantom who belonged to the streets. Women felt him in every shadow, men felt him in every echo of footsteps. The police could not find him, and that made him feel untouchable. The terror escalated on the night of September 30th, 1888. It began with Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish woman who had struggled through poverty and heartbreak, just like so many others in Whitechapel. Her friends knew her as Long Liz. She had quarreled earlier that night at her lodging house, and by evening she was seen near Berner Street. Some witnesses recalled her with a man who carried a small parcel wrapped in newspaper. They argued, then vanished into the darkness. At 1 a.m, a man making his way into a yard behind a socialist club stumbled upon her body. Elizabeth Stride's throat had been slashed, blood pooling beneath her, but her body bore none of the terrible mutilations seen in the earlier murders. At first, detectives wondered if this even was the Ripper at all. But one detail struck them immediately: the swiftness. Whoever attacked her had been interrupted, startled by something, and fled before finishing his ritual. If he had been disturbed, then what followed next was his way of making up for it. Less than an hour later, only a few streets away, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square. Her injuries were far worse. Her throat was cut to the bone, her face slashed beyond recognition, and her abdomen savaged with a cruelty that shocked even the most seasoned policemen. A kidney had been removed and taken from the scene. The Ripper had vanished into the night again, but not before leaving behind another sinister clue. On the wall of a nearby doorway, chalked words were discovered: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning was unclear. Some argued it was a deliberate attempt to ignite anti-Semitic violence in a neighborhood already tense with prejudice. Others believed it to be a message from the killer himself, a taunt to the police. Commissioner Charles Warren ordered it erased almost immediately, fearing riots would erupt if the message spread. To some, it was a necessary act. To others, it destroyed one of the only written traces the Ripper ever left behind. The press seized upon what they called the double event. It was unlike anything London had seen. 2 women murdered within an hour of each other, one possibly interrupted, the other slaughtered with unspeakable precision. The city erupted with fear and outrage. Newspaper boys shouted headlines in the streets, crowds gathered at murder sites, and women begged for protection. The killer was not slowing down, he was accelerating. Detectives scrambled for answers. Witnesses had reported seeing Eddowes shortly before her death, drunk and staggering in the street. Some said she was accompanied by a man with a fair mustache. Others described him as foreign-looking. Still others claimed he wore a sailor's cap. The descriptions contradicted each other, and the fog of Whitechapel swallowed all certainty. The killer remained faceless. Letters began to pour into the police and the press. Most were dismissed as hoaxes, written by pranksters or journalists chasing sensationalism. But one letter, received by the Central News Agency just days before the double murders, chilled investigators. It was signed with the name that would become infamous, Jack the Ripper. The letter taunted police, mocked their efforts, and promised more killings to come. Its timing, arriving just before the double murders, gave it weight. Was it truly written by the killer, or was it a cruel coincidence? No one knew. In Whitechapel, fear reached its peak. Women refused to walk alone. Markets emptied earlier than usual. Even the toughest men admitted they would not venture down certain alleys after dark. The police patrolled with greater numbers, yet they felt powerless. The Ripper was striking right under their noses, and the more they searched, the more invisible he became. The murders of Stride and Eddowes marked a turning point. No longer could anyone hope this nightmare might end on its own. The killer had grown bold enough to kill twice in one night, bold enough to leave behind a message, bold enough to mock the very people hunting him. Scotland Yard faced mounting pressure from the public, the newspapers, and the government itself. Catch him, or watch London descend into chaos. But the Ripper had no intention of stopping. The streets of Whitechapel were his hunting ground, and his next victim would prove that the worst was still to come. The autumn of 1888 had already been stained with fear. Whitechapel lived under curfew of the imagination, where every shadow threatened violence and every sound after dark made hearts stop. But if the city thought it had already seen the worst of Jack the Ripper, it was wrong. The horror still had one final act to play, and it would eclipse everything that came before. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly. She was only 25 years old, the youngest of all the victims, and unlike the others, she lived not on the streets but in a single rented room at Miller's Court. Friends remembered her as pretty, with bright hair and a kind manner, though poverty had forced her into the same trade that left so many women vulnerable. Mary Jane's life had been unsettled, stories of an Irish birth, time in Wales, and a fall into London's underworld. But on the surface, she was just another woman trying to survive the East End. On the night of November 8th, Mary Jane was last seen in the company of friends at a pub. She sang that evening, a sweet and haunting song that lingered with those who heard it. By midnight, she was back in her small room. A neighbor later recalled faint singing drifting through the thin walls in the early hours, but as the night deepened, silence returned. No one could have imagined the nightmare unfolding behind that closed door. At 10:45 the next morning, Mary Jane's landlord sent his assistant to collect overdue rent. When there was no answer, he pushed aside a curtain that covered the window and peered inside. What he saw made him stagger back in shock. The room was soaked in blood. The bed was a butcher's table, and on it lay what little remained of Mary Jane Kelly. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition. The brutality was unlike any of the previous murders. her throat slashed to the spine, her abdomen ripped open, her organs scattered around the room, parts of her body cut away entirely. The walls bore the spray of violence, and the small room felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Even hardened policemen, men who had seen every kind of crime, were shaken. Some stepped back out into the court just to catch their breath. One detective whispered that it was the work of a man who had gone mad. Another insisted it was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. News of the murder spread faster than wildfire. By afternoon, Miller's court was swarmed with crowds. Reporters jostled with officers, desperate for details, while neighbors wept at the thought that such savagery could take place so close to their homes. The press called it the worst murder London had ever seen, and for once, no one could disagree. The police examined the room for every possible clue. But the Ripper had chosen well. A private room meant privacy to commit his crime without fear of interruption. The walls themselves had contained his rage. Outside, the city bustled, unaware of the storm just a few feet away. By the time Mary Jane Kelly was found, the killer was long gone, slipping back into the fog with his secret intact. This murder was different not only for its brutality, but for what it suggested about the Ripper himself. Until now, he had struck in public spaces, yards, alleys, squares, always risking discovery, always leaving his victims where they could be quickly found. But in Miller's court, he had time. He had silence. He had the privacy to do what he wanted without interruption. And what he wanted, judging by the scene, was to obliterate his victim completely. Forensic knowledge of the time could not process what modern investigators might have gleaned. No fingerprints, no blood analysis, no DNA. The detectives could only sketch, note, and speculate. Some believed Mary Jane's murder was a culmination, the killer reaching the peak of his compulsion before disappearing forever. Others believed it was an accident of opportunity. He had found a room, taken advantage of it, and then chosen to vanish because the city was closing in. What followed was confusion. After Mary Jane Kelly's death, the murder stopped. Just as suddenly as the Ripper had appeared, he was gone. No more bodies turned up in the fog. No more mutilations haunted the morgues. London had been tormented for months, and then the silence returned. But silence brought no comfort. It brought only questions. Had the killer been caught for some other crime? Had he left the city? Had he died or simply decided to stop? The mystery deepened and the legend was born. For the families, there was no peace. For the police, no victory. For the city, no closure. The final scene in Miller's court was burned into the minds of everyone who saw it, and the photographs that survive still shock us more than a century later. Mary Jane Kelly's death was not just another murder. It was the final exclamation mark of terror. And yet, in some ways, it was only the beginning. Because from that day forward, the hunt for Jack the Ripper became more than just an investigation. It became an obsession that would span generations, cross continents, and ignite endless theories. Detectives had failed, time had passed, but the question remained, and it would only grow louder. Who was Jack the Ripper? The answer, some say, lies in the suspects who walked those streets. Men with secrets, men with shadows in their past. Men who, even now, more than a century later, still carry the weight of suspicion. The murders had ended, but the hunt for the Ripper's identity was only beginning. By the time Mary Jane Kelly's body was carried out of Miller's court, the city of London was in uproar. The public demanded answers, the newspapers screamed for action, and Scotland Yard found itself cornered by a nightmare it could not contain. Detectives had been on the case for months, but each murder left them further behind, as if they were chasing a phantom that knew their every move. Now, after the fifth and most horrifying killing, the pressure reached its breaking point. At the center of the investigation stood Inspector Frederick Aberline, a man hardened by years in Whitechapel, who knew the streets better than most of his colleagues. Aberline was not a man easily rattled, yet even he admitted that the Ripper murders were unlike anything he had faced before. He and his team worked tirelessly, walking the alleys at night, questioning lodging house keepers, and piecing together the fragments of testimony from witnesses who often contradicted one another. Detective Donald Swanson, another key figure, kept meticulous notes, building profiles of possible suspects. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson pushed theories of his own, suggesting that the killer was likely a local man of foreign descent. The problem was that none of their suspicions could be pinned down with hard evidence. The Ripper struck fast, vanished faster, and left behind scenes of horror that offered no trail to follow. The police turned to the public for help. Posters were printed, urging anyone with information to come forward. Plainclothes officers mingled with crowds at night, watching for suspicious behavior. Patrols were increased, and for a time the streets swarmed with uniformed men. But the East End was a maze of passageways, alleys, and hidden courtyards. A killer who knew the area could disappear in seconds. No amount of boots on the ground could change that. And then there were the letters. Dozens, then hundreds began pouring in, some addressed to the police, others to newspapers. Most were the work of pranksters, eager to play upon the city's fear. But a few stood out. One, written in red ink, carried the now infamous signature, Jack the Ripper. It mocked the detectives, taunted them with promises of more killings, and seemed to revel in the chaos it had caused. Another, sent with a small cardboard box, contained half of a preserved kidney, supposedly from Catherine Eddowes. Whether genuine or hoax, it shocked the investigators and made the public even more convinced that the Ripper was not only a killer but a sadist who enjoyed the terror he created. The police debated endlessly over these letters. Were they written by the Ripper himself or by journalists trying to sell more papers? Some believed the handwriting was too theatrical, the tone too staged. Others argued that the details were too precise to ignore. But in the end, the truth slipped through their fingers just as surely as the killer did. With every murder, the critics grew louder. The press accused Scotland Yard of incompetence. Politicians whispered about failures of leadership. Ordinary citizens spat insults at patrolling officers, blaming them for not catching the man who stalked their streets. Aberline and his men worked through sleepless nights, but exhaustion and frustration took their toll. Each false lead, each dead end, made the Ripper's shadow loom larger. At times, the investigation bordered on desperation. Dozens of men were arrested on suspicion, held briefly, then released when no evidence could be found. Butchers were questioned, doctors interrogated, immigrants harassed by angry mobs convinced that the killer was a foreigner. One man was nearly lynched by a crowd simply for walking alone at night with a parcel under his arm. Fear had turned Whitechapel into a tinderbox, and the police were struggling to keep it from erupting. Inside Scotland Yard, theories clashed. Anderson leaned heavily on the idea that the Ripper was Jewish, pointing to fragments of witness testimony and even the chalked graffito near Mitre Square. Others disagreed, warning that focusing too narrowly risked missing the true killer. The disagreements fractured the investigation, leaving detectives divided when they needed unity most. In the end, the Ripper was always one step ahead. He knew the alleys, knew the patrol routes, and struck only when the conditions were perfect. Some whispered that he might have been a policeman himself, using inside knowledge to evade capture. Others swore he was a doctor, skilled with a blade and too clever to be caught. Whoever he was, he seemed untouchable, as if the fog of Whitechapel itself conspired to hide him. By early 1889, the murders had stopped. The police braced for another strike, but none came. The silence was almost worse than the killings. Had they scared him off with their patrols? Had he fled the city? Had he died or been locked away for another crime? Aberline and his men combed through reports, hoping for a clue, but the trail went cold. The killer who had terrorized London for months had vanished, leaving only bodies, fear, and questions. For the detectives, it was a bitter ending. They had been tasked with stopping the most infamous murderer of their age, and they had failed. The public never forgave them. The newspapers never let the case go. And the Ripper, whoever he was, had slipped through their grasp, becoming less a man and more a legend. But while the official hunt ended in frustration, the story was far from over. because in the years and decades that followed, suspicion would fall on names that still echo today. Suspects with strange habits, violent histories, and disturbing connections to Whitechapel. Some were men who had walked those streets in silence, unnoticed. Others were men of influence, protected by wealth or position. And though the murders had stopped, the search for Jack the Ripper's identity had only just begun. The murders had stopped, but the questions did not. The women of Whitechapel were buried, their families left with grief that never healed, and still the city searched for someone to blame. The police had no answers, and so suspicion began to fall on men who had crossed those foggy streets, men who left whispers in their wake. Some of their names would be forgotten by time. Others would be etched into history, carrying the weight of guilt even without proof. The name that rose to the surface most often was Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish-born barber who had come to London with his family, living in the very heart of Whitechapel. By the time of the murders, he was known in the neighborhood as a troubled soul, plagued by strange habits and deteriorating mental health. Years later, documents from the investigators themselves revealed that Kosminski had been a prime suspect. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson even wrote that the Ripper had been identified by a witness who refused to testify against him in court. Yet Kosminski was never arrested. Instead, he was eventually committed to an asylum, where he lived out the rest of his life until his death in 1919. Some say he was dismissed too quickly. Others argue that his illness and instability matched the pattern of the killings. His name would resurface again and again, haunting every new wave of investigation. But Kosminski was not alone. Another suspect who drew attention was Montague Druitt, a barrister and part-time school teacher. He was intelligent, educated, and outwardly respectable. Yet in December of 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, Druitt was found dead in the Thames, an apparent suicide. His death fueled speculation that he had taken his own life to escape the mounting pressure after committing the murders. Scotland Yard officials noted him as a strong candidate, and his name lingered in official memoranda. But his family insisted he had simply been battling depression, and no evidence tied him directly to the crimes. Still, his timing, his death aligning with the end of the murders, was a coincidence too tempting to ignore. Then there was James Kelly, a convicted murderer who had escaped from Broadmoor Asylum months before the killings began. Kelly had already proven his capacity for violence by stabbing his wife in a fit of rage. After his escape, he vanished into the East End, resurfacing only decades later when he returned voluntarily to Broadmoor, confessing that he had lived in America and across London during the missing years. Some modern researchers point to his violent history and his ability to hide in plain sight as evidence he could have been the Ripper. But again, nothing conclusive was ever found. Another name whispered in the alleys was Charles Lechmere, a carman who had been the first to discover one of the victims. At the inquest, he gave his name as Charles Cross, the surname of his stepfather, which immediately raised suspicion for some. Why had he used an alias? Why had he stumbled upon the body at the exact moment he did? To many, it seemed too convenient. And to modern eyes, his route to work placed him directly in the path of multiple murder sites. Some researchers argue that his calm demeanor at the inquest was the mask of a man hiding in plain sight. Others dismiss the theory as nothing more than coincidence built on circumstance. But the idea that the Ripper himself may have stood among the witnesses has haunted the case ever since. Beyond these names were others who drifted in and out of the suspect lists: doctors, butchers, lunatics, even aristocrats. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a hatred of women, was arrested in London during the killings, though on unrelated charges. His wealth allowed him to flee back to America, and some believed he escaped just in time. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born criminal with a history of fraud and violence, was listed by police, but later proven to be incarcerated during some of the murders. And in the fevered imaginations of conspiracy theorists, Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, was accused of being at the heart of a cover-up that shielded the royal family from scandal. That theory, though dramatic, has long been discredited by historians. What all these men had in common was not proof, but possibility. Each carried a piece of the puzzle, a shadow that might fit the Ripper's shape, but none could ever be pinned down with certainty. The more suspect Scotland Yard considered, the further away the truth seemed to slip. For the public, each new name offered hope of resolution, but it always ended the same way, with doubt. Witnesses contradicted one another. Records clashed. The fog of Whitechapel blurred every detail until all that remained were stories that refused to align. And so, the legend grew. The Ripper was not just a killer anymore. He was a question without an answer, a name without a face. Some believed the police knew the truth and buried it. Others believed the killer had been an ordinary man who walked among them, unnoticed until he struck. And the rest, the ones who stared at the murder photographs and read every detail in the papers, wondered if he had been a genius, a madman, or something in between. But history did not stop digging. Long after the detectives of Scotland Yard were gone, new generations of researchers took up the case. They studied the same streets, pored over the same files, and hunted the same ghost. And in time, science itself would enter the story, bringing tools the Victorians could never imagine, tools that could reach back through a century of silence and touch the fabric of the evidence itself. That is where the case shifted once more. Because if the witnesses and the records could not tell us who Jack the Ripper was, perhaps DNA could. For more than 100 years, Jack the Ripper's identity remained locked in the fog of Whitechapel. The detectives had failed, the suspects multiplied, and the truth slipped further into the realm of legend. But in the 21st century, something unexpected happened. Science, the one weapon the Victorians never had, was turned against the past. And in that moment, the story of Jack the Ripper surged back into the headlines, as if the killer had returned to taunt the living once again. The spark came from an unlikely source, a shawl. It was said to have been found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, the fourth canonical victim, who was murdered in Mitre Square. For more than a century, the shawl had passed through hands, preserved as a grim relic of the crime. Some called it a family heirloom, others dismissed it as nothing more than a curiosity. But in 2014, an author and amateur investigator named Russell Edwards announced that this shawl might hold the answer the world had been waiting for. On the dark fabric, he claimed, there were stains, bloodstains, and other biological traces that had never been tested. He worked with scientists to analyze the material, extracting fragments of mitochondrial DNA. The results, Edwards said, were astonishing. The samples appeared to match descendants of Catherine Eddowes herself, and descendants of none other than Aaron Kosminski, the troubled Polish barber long suspected by Scotland Yard. In a dramatic statement, Edwards declared that the mystery of Jack the Ripper was solved, that Kosminski was the killer, and that the evidence proved it with 100% certainty. The news spread across the globe in hours. Newspapers blared the headline, "Jack the Ripper identified." Documentaries rushed to cover the revelation. Families of the victims, still connected by the weight of history, said at last there might be closure. For a moment, it seemed as if the ghost of Whitechapel had finally been unmasked. But not everyone was convinced. Almost immediately, experts began questioning the claim. The first doubt was the shawl itself. Could it truly be proven that the fabric had been at the crime scene in 1888? Its history was murky at best, passed down through generations without an unbroken chain of custody. Forensic science depends on certainty, but here the very foundation of the evidence was shaky. How many hands had touched it? How many times had it been exposed to contamination? Could DNA from Kosminski's family line have been introduced decades later by accident? The questions piled up. The second doubt was the science itself. The DNA analysis Edwards presented had not been peer-reviewed. The results were released in a book and in media appearances, not in academic journals where other scientists could scrutinize the methods. Specialists in genetics pointed out that mitochondrial DNA, the type extracted from the shawl, is not unique to an individual. It can match entire family groups, meaning that even if the test was correct, it could not point to Aaron Kosminski with absolute certainty. Still, the allure of the claim was powerful. For the first time, there was a tangible piece of evidence connecting a suspect to a victim. Edward stood by his conclusion, and many in the public embraced it. After all, Kosminski had been on the suspect list from the very beginning. Could it be that the detectives of 1888 had been right all along, but lacked the tools to prove it? In 2025, the story roared back into the spotlight. Descendants of the victims called for an official inquest to be reopened, arguing that the evidence should be recognized and the killer finally named. Families spoke of closure, of giving justice to women whose lives had been forgotten in the shadow of the Ripper's fame. Newspapers and broadcasters once again carried the story, some proclaiming that Jack the Ripper had finally been identified, others warning that the science remained deeply flawed. The debate became fierce. On one side, those who believed the case was solved, that history could finally be corrected. On the other, those who argued that declaring certainty on such shaky ground was reckless, that it risked rewriting history without proof. Scotland Yard remained silent, unwilling to endorse or deny the claims. Historians reminded the world that the Ripper was not only a killer but a cultural myth, and myths are not so easily buried. Yet the fascination only grew. Tour in Whitechapel now included the story of the shawl, guides pointing to it as the closest thing to a smoking gun the case had ever seen. True crime enthusiasts debated the findings endlessly, while scientists argued over contamination, methodology, and the limits of forensic technology on century-old fabric. For every expert who dismissed the evidence, another defended it as plausible. The truth remained caught between, and in that tension lies the power of the story. Because whether or not Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, the fact that his name still stirs debate more than a century later shows how deep the legend runs. The shawl may or may not carry his guilt, but it has certainly carried the case back into the spotlight, keeping the Ripper alive in the imagination of millions. But if the shawl divides us, it also points to something larger. It reminds us that Jack the Ripper was never just about murder. He was about fear, about obsession, about the lengths we go to find answers in the dark. For every test run on the shawl, there is another suspect waiting in the files. For every claim of certainty, there is another voice warning of doubt. The Ripper remains what he has always been, a question without an answer. And yet, the DNA breakthrough, flawed or not, has changed the conversation forever. No longer are we only debating old witness statements and faded police files. Now we are debating science itself, the possibility that modern tools can reach through time and pull a killer from the shadows. Whether true or false, the idea that Jack the Ripper can be solved with DNA has reignited the hunt. But if Kosminski is not the answer, then who is? Because behind his name, others still linger: Druitt, Kelly, Lechmere, and more, each carrying their own secrets, their own reasons to be feared. And as the 21st century searches for closure, the Ripper's face may still be hiding elsewhere, waiting to be found. For all the weight given to Kosminski and Druitt, the hunt for Jack the Ripper never stopped there. The case grew into a kind of net, sweeping up anyone whose life, habits, or misfortune happened to brush against Whitechapel in 1888. Some suspects were criminals by trade, others men of influence, and some were simply outsiders who fit the public's image of a monster. Each new name brought hope of resolution, and each time certainty slipped away. One of the strangest figures to fall under suspicion was Francis Tumblety, an American doctor of questionable skill and even more questionable morals. He traveled through London during the Ripper murders, living lavishly while parading himself as a man of medicine. But behind the polished exterior was a man with deep contempt for women, a misogyny so open that acquaintances later described his rants about their corruption. When police arrested him during the Autumn of Terror, not for murder but on unrelated charges of gross indecency, the timing was enough to spark whispers. Tumblety fled back to America before the year was over, and though Scotland Yard kept him on their list, no evidence ever tied him directly to the killings. Still, to some, the idea of a foreign doctor who despised women fit too neatly to ignore. Another suspect, far less flamboyant, was Chaim Hyams, a local man with a history of seizures, alcoholism, and violent outbursts. His life unraveled during the same period, and he often roamed the streets of Whitechapel, his behavior alarming neighbors. When committed to asylums, doctors noted his aggression and his tendency to wander at night. Some modern researchers believe his profile matches the Ripper's movements, that his medical condition might explain the unpredictability of the crimes. But Hyams was also pitiable, broken by illness, and historians remain divided on whether he had the cunning required to evade the police so completely. Then there was Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man who drifted across Europe under countless names. Scotland Yard itself listed him as a possible suspect in the years after the murders, describing him as a dangerous and violent man with medical pretensions. But the evidence against him collapsed when researchers discovered that he had been in custody during at least part of the Ripper's reign. Still, his name lingered in the files, another ghost of suspicion that history would never quite release. And in the fevered imaginations of Victorian London, suspicion reached even higher. Whispers began to link the murders to the royal family itself, a theory born out of scandal, secrecy, and the hunger for a dramatic story. Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, was said to have led a double life in the East End, consorting with women far below his station. Conspiracy theorists spun tales that the Ripper murders were part of a cover-up to protect him, that servants or physicians silenced the women who might expose a royal scandal. The theory spread quickly, fueled by the public's distrust of power, but it fell apart under scrutiny. Records showed Albert Victor was not even in London during several of the murders. Still, the story was too sensational to die, and for decades it lived on in books, films, and whispers of corruption reaching the highest levels of society. Others cast suspicion on butchers, slaughterhouse workers, or surgeons, men who possessed the skill with knives that the mutilations seemed to suggest. Each time a woman was found in the darkened streets, the question rose again: who among them knew how to cut with such precision? But Whitechapel was full of men who fit that description, and none could ever be tied to the killings. The widening gallery of suspects says as much about fear as it does about evidence. In the absence of certainty, anyone could be Jack the Ripper. The foreign doctor, the violent local, the criminal drifter, even the royal prince. The mystery was like a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of the people who searched for answers. Immigrants, outsiders, the powerful, the poor, all were blamed in turn, as the city wrestled with the idea that the killer could be anyone, and worse, that he might never be known. What unites these suspects is not proof but possibility. Each carried a story that brushed against the facts. Each carried shadows that fit the outline of a killer who vanished into the fog. And for each, there were just enough contradictions, just enough doubt to keep the case alive. The tragedy, of course, is that for Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, these names brought no justice. Their lives were reduced to evidence files, their memories overshadowed by the men accused of ending them. The case became not only a hunt for a murderer, but a stage where theories outshone the women who suffered. And so the suspect list grew into legend, expanding with each generation, until Jack the Ripper became less of a man and more of a question mark hanging over history. Some believed the killer was caught and hidden from view. Others believed he died after the last murder, taking his secret to the grave. But most accepted the darkest possibility, that the Ripper walked away, anonymous, and melted back into the crowd, leaving London to fear a ghost that never faded. The suspect gallery is long, but it is also unfinished, because even as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and the 20th to the 21st, new names continued to emerge. With every discovery, every theory, the hunt reignited. And then, when science entered the story with DNA, the gallery of suspects shrank once more until the spotlight focused almost entirely on one man, Kosminski. But even if the shawl and the tests point to him, the question lingers. What if the Ripper was not Kosminski? What if the DNA is flawed, the evidence tainted, the conclusion too easy? If not him, then perhaps the answer still lies in the shadows of that wider gallery, waiting, watching, hiding in plain sight all along. The killings ended in 1888, but the Ripper never really left. Long after the streets of Whitechapel fell silent, his shadow continued to stretch across generations, reshaping itself with each retelling. The man who vanished into the fog became more than a killer. He became a story, and that story refused to die. It began with the newspapers, which had already fanned the flames while the murders were happening. Each new killing was splashed across the front pages with grisly detail. The victims described not as people, but as symbols of terror. The press gave the killer his name, Jack the Ripper, a moniker that was catchy, chilling, and unforgettable. That name did what no real investigation could. It made him immortal. From there, the legend grew. Penny dreadfuls, cheap illustrated booklets of the late Victorian age, turned the Ripper into lurid entertainment, mixing fact and fiction until the boundary blurred. The public consumed the stories with a morbid fascination, both horrified and captivated by the idea of a faceless monster lurking in the fog. The women he killed faded into background figures, while the killer himself became the star of his own dreadful theater. As decades passed, the story followed new mediums. In the 20th century, films brought the Ripper to life on the screen. Alfred Hitchcock's early silent thriller The Lodger hinted at him in shadow, while later films embraced his image directly, some painting him as a mad surgeon, others as a deranged aristocrat. Hollywood and British studios alike found that the mystery could be bent into almost any shape: horror, thriller, even melodrama. Each version offered answers that real history never could. Books followed the same path. Authors turned the Ripper case into a canvas for endless speculation. Some focused on the suspects, others crafted elaborate conspiracies. Historical fiction gave him new victims, new voices, even new continents to haunt. What none of these works could offer was certainty, but that was never the point. The Ripper became less about who he truly was and more about what he represented. The fear of the unknown, the cruelty hidden in plain sight, the darkness that could walk beside you and vanish before dawn. Even scholars could not resist. Academic studies poured over the case, some searching for patterns in the psychology of serial killers, others dissecting the role of Victorian society in shaping the crimes. The Ripper became a symbol not just of violence, but of misogyny, poverty, and the failures of justice. He was a lens through which entire generations examined themselves. And then there were the tour. In the streets of Whitechapel today, guides still lead groups down narrow alleys, pointing to cobblestones where the murders once happened. They hold up faded photographs, speak in hushed tones, and let the imagination do the rest. Tourists peer into the shadows, trying to glimpse a world that no longer exists, while the ghost of the Ripper lingers as a selling point. His name fills brochures, haunts gift shops, and fuels an industry of fascination built on fear. But perhaps the most telling sign of the Ripper's cultural grip is the way his image has been reshaped to fit every era. In some tellings, he is a monstrous brute, an embodiment of savagery. In others, he is a gentleman killer, a figure of intelligence and control, wielding his knife with clinical precision. He is at once a symbol of madness and of cold calculation, a reflection of whatever fear a generation needs him to be. The danger in this is clear. The victims, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, risk being lost in the noise. Their lives, their struggles, and their humanity are too often overshadowed by the myth of the man who killed them. Each time the Ripper is turned into entertainment, each time he becomes the headline or the monster in a film, the women themselves slip further into the margins of history. And yet, the fascination persists. The Ripper endures because he is unsolved. His story is a locked door, and human beings cannot resist trying the key. We chase certainty even when certainty is impossible. We tell and retell the tale because the mystery gives us something the truth never could: endless possibilities. In that sense, Jack the Ripper has become more than a killer. He has become a mirror, reflecting our fears, our obsessions, and our willingness to turn horror into legend. The Ripper is not only the man who stalked Whitechapel. He is the story we continue to tell about ourselves. But obsession cuts both ways. For every book, every film, every tour, there are families who still carry the weight of the murders. For them, this is not myth or entertainment. It is history written in blood. And in recent years, as DNA and forensic claims push Kosminski's name forward once again, those families have raised their voices, asking for closure. They are tired of the myth. They want truth. They want the case resolved not as a story but as justice. And that brings us back to the present, where the debate rages on. Science promises answers. History resists. The Ripper remains caught between them, both man and myth, both ghost and headline. We can turn him into a film villain or a conspiracy theory, but until the question of his identity is settled, the cultural obsession will never end. The story of Jack the Ripper began with fear in the alleys of Whitechapel, but today it is something larger. It is a reminder that mysteries can outlive time itself, that the need for answers can become as powerful as the crimes that first sparked the questions. And as we look toward closure, we must ask ourselves, will naming a killer finally end the obsession, or will the myth of Jack the Ripper always outlive the truth? More than a century has passed since the last scream echoed in Whitechapel, and still Jack the Ripper refuses to rest. The murders ended in 1888, but the story has never stopped. The streets are different now, cleaner, brighter, full of tourists instead of terror, yet the question of identity still hangs in the air like fog. And in recent years, that question has taken on new urgency, not just from historians and investigators, but from the families of the women themselves. For them, the Ripper is not a myth. He is not a character in books, not a villain on the screen, not a ghost for tour guides to conjure in the alleys. For them, he is the man who destroyed lives, who left scars that traveled down through generations. To this day, descendants of the victims speak of the burden, of the way their ancestors' names are remembered only as victims of a monster rather than as women with lives, families, and dignity. They want that burden lifted. They want a name, a face, something to hold accountable. That is why the DNA claim struck such a nerve. When Russell Edwards announced that Aaron Kosminski had been identified, families stepped forward. They said at last, after 137 years, they might have closure. Some called for Scotland Yard to reopen the inquest, to name Kosminski officially as the killer, and to give history a resolution it had denied for so long. They wanted justice, not in the form of punishment, for that was impossible, but in the form of truth. But truth, in this case, is complicated. Experts warn that the DNA evidence is not enough, that the shawl cannot be trusted, that contamination and flawed science may have led to false certainty. They argue that to close the file on such shaky ground would be to betray history, to silence questions that still deserve to be asked. If we name the wrong man, do we not only fail the victims again, but also trap them forever in a false ending? The debate has divided the world of ripperology, the historians, researchers, and enthusiasts who dedicate themselves to the case. Some argue that the hunt should end, that naming Kosminski brings dignity to the victims and allows the world to move on. Others say the case must remain open, that the lack of certainty keeps alive the possibility that the real killer still hides among the other suspects. And in that division lies the very heart of the problem. Closure is not just about facts. It is about what we choose to believe. The police have remained silent. Scotland Yard, once humiliated by its failure to catch the killer, has not stepped forward to declare the case closed. Without official recognition, the debate continues. Journalists report each new claim as if the case has finally been solved, only for experts to dismantle it days later. The cycle repeats. the myth grows stronger and the truth remains just out of reach. For the city of London, the Ripper has become part of its identity, a scar that will never fade. His name fills bookshelves, museum exhibits, guided tour. He is as much a business as he is a mystery. To erase him with certainty might bring peace to families, but it might also strip away the legend that has gripped the public for more than a century. And so, the myth persists, because in some ways it is more profitable than the truth. But for the women, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, the legend is no comfort. Their lives were stolen, their names reduced to footnotes in the shadow of a faceless killer. For them, closure is not about myth. It is about memory. It is about restoring their humanity, about reminding the world that they were more than victims. They were mothers, daughters, friends, women who deserved more than to be remembered only as bodies in the fog. The final question, then, is not only who Jack the Ripper was, but whether we are willing to let him remain unsolved. Would certainty bring peace, or would it only kill the story? Would the families finally rest, or would new voices rise to doubt the evidence all over again? Perhaps the truth will never satisfy because the truth can never undo what was done. Yet the hunt continues. The files are revisited, the theories rewritten, the DNA tested again and again. Every time we stand on the edge of an answer, and every time the fog rolls in to swallow it. That is the power of Jack the Ripper. Not only the crimes he committed, but the hold he still has on us, the way we cannot let go of the mystery, the way we refuse to close the file. And so, more than a century later, the Ripper still walks with us, not in flesh and blood, but in story and speculation, in fear and fascination. The case remains open in the minds of millions, each of us still searching for the face in the fog. And if closure never comes, then perhaps the Ripper will remain what he has always been, not a man, but a question. But history does not like questions without answers. And as the world continues to turn, one truth remains. Someone killed those women. Someone walked those streets, knife in hand, and disappeared into the mist. And whether or not we ever name him, the fact will never change. The Ripper was real. The terror was real. The blood was real. The only mystery is whether the truth will ever be.
What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Click here to watch the next video as we uncover another thrilling crime case.